7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Howdy, Croc Nation. Dr. Tommy and Ellie here with another amazing Croc podcast. Joining me, as always, Robin to my Batman, my best pal, Angel Santana from Have Faith, Let It Begin. Angel, how are you, my friend?
We are fine and dandy on this amazing 4th of July weekend special. I brought out the awesome brand new addition to the Croc podcast. I didn't even bring it out on my podcast. I brought it out on yours, the brand new billboard hat. And we're talking about every little thing on top. So when we put this on video, they're going to love it.
Yeah, I have to say that if I didn't think that civilization had ended, that hat has confirmed that to me. Angel is wearing a billboard hat with sort of going through all these neon colorful letters about the Croc podcast, about he and I, about what today's podcast is about. I really hope you guys get to see this piece of work that Angel has procured for us on the YouTube channel. Angel, tell me a little bit about our podcast on the YouTube channel.
You know, I'm so glad you said that, because I was going to stop you and say, look, with firecrackers going off, we got to remember to remind our Croc podcast, our Croc Nation, that we are available on every single platform, every platform. That's how popular we have. But we need your support. We need you to like and follow us and subscribe to us. We need your feedback. Feedback is important. If we get feedback, it will allow us to be put on more platforms. So how do we get a hold of us? If you have an Apple phone, we're on Apple Podcasts. We're on our YouTube channel. We have our own Facebook account. We have our own website. We actually are on, formerly known as Twitter, X. We are on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and the list continues to go on. And just as a little tidbit to everybody out there, we all know what Amazon sounds like, right? We know Amazon. Did you know we're on Amazon Music? We're on Amazon Music under podcast. That's how you can find the Croc podcast. And I'm just asking you now as a favor. We've been on the air now many years. We need you to subscribe. We need you to follow. We need you to like us, because that really is what we're all about. We have never truly asked this of you. I know that Dr. E will tell me, listen, we don't always advertise the way we want to advertise, the way I'm pushing it right now, because we are all about you, the survivor. But let's be honest, the more that we can allow ourselves to share to one another, it's only going to help others that are dealing with, with cancer, with all different prognoses. And not only that, they get a chance to be entertained and also educated on the subject.
Angel, thank you for that impassioned, discussion about what platforms we're on. That's unfortunately not my strong suit, and I'm glad it is yours. And I agree with you. I think that it's not really for our own edification or for our own ego stroke. It's really for you guys, for our survivor thrivers, and also, for my colleagues and Angel's colleagues out there who work in hospitals, who take care of these amazing patients and these wonderfully brave, courageous people that we call the survivor thriver. And so Angel, I have to say, one of the things about my podcast that's different than yours is you're much better about leading up to a holiday or a special occasion, and you do specialized podcasts to commemorate, the seasons and the different holidays. And, I haven't done as good a job, putting timely podcasts on that represent what's in front of us, like Memorial Day or 4th of July or Labor Day or whatever, Christmas, Easter, Kwanzaa, you name it. I really haven't done that good of a job trying to align my podcast to real-time holidays. And we have done a few podcasts about our nationalism, about being patriotic, about being proud to be American, and again, with zero politics behind it. We're not pushing any agenda for anybody. I don't care if one of the major parties were to give us $3 trillion. I'd have to say, I'm sorry. I have to take that $3 trillion and put it in my pocket, but I am not going to use it for the Croc podcast. No, I would not take the money in any way. We do not want to be associated with any agenda. But with that being said, July 4th is a very important holiday, and we are very grateful for Ramon, Mr. Ruda, who did that amazing 1.5 hour podcast several years ago about his experiences in America, especially during the 1960s and 70s, and how he had breakfast with Jimmy Carter and all the changes he did in the Bronx with low-income housing. And that's a beautiful story, and I love replaying it on July 4th. But this year, we're actually going to do a July 4th special, and I'm really proud of that. Angel, your thoughts?
I agree. And what's great about our podcast and is that they can always go back and listen to previous episodes. They don't ever really get old. But I would like to correct you, Dr. And I don't like to do that because, quite honestly, I think that you don't need to be corrected. But I will say this: you don't have to do, every podcast is different. And your podcast doesn't always have to commemorate certain holidays. I know you want to be, and that's because we on this podcast deal with what is in our hearts, what is in your mind, and what you feel needs to be told. If it falls on a holiday and we remember, we don't ever really forget. We always mention it, but you talk about the subjects that you know is geared and you it's geared and set up for those that really need to listen. And you know
I
what?
really
That is the
appreciate that. Yeah.
spirit of CROC Nation.
Thank you, Angel. And actually, with that being said, thank you for saying that. But this particular week's dedication to our country, to this great country we call America, was really stimulated and was inspired by a bunch of survivor thrivers that I'm very honored to have served and very honored to have become, to have that I could call them friends, actually. And these are veterans. So I thought maybe it would be a nice thing to take the inspiration I've gotten from these 3 or 4 gentlemen and actually make a podcast to honor them. And what I especially, so first and foremost, any survivor thriver who has served in the military, whether you never left Fort Dix or whether you were sent to Vietnam or whether you served in Korea, whether there were bullets flying over your head or only bottles of ketchup, like in the old Popeye Bluto flights with with the ketchup flying through the air. It doesn't really matter to us. You are special, and we are very grateful for your service, especially on this July 4th special episode. Furthermore, I am going to particularly dedicate, and you'll find out why later, this podcast to our Vietnam veterans. And there's a couple of reasons why I want to do that. Number one is that I was too young to go to Vietnam, but I was old enough to know what was going on in Vietnam. So you have these young kids, 18 to 22 or however old they were. And, some of them signed up, some of them got drafted. You have to understand what their thought process was back in the 1960s. So these are children. These are called baby boomers. These are children of men and women who served the country during World War II. Now, I don't think anybody can dispute that World War II was probably the most important military action in my lifetime. It was before both of our lifetimes, Angel, but my father actually served in World War II. And our process, I'm a baby boomer, but a younger baby boomer. So some of my contemporaries, maybe 10 years older than me, they were really brought up with the notion that America, serving the American, ideal and going into the military and fighting a war was the right thing to do. And those were the gentlemen and ladies and women who signed up to go to Vietnam and to serve in Vietnam. Then there was the draft. So there were people that didn't want to go to Vietnam, but they ended up getting drafted. And then there was the whole rigmarole about what our country and the world thought about our involvement in Vietnam, and the draft dodgers and people going to Canada and people refusing to serve. Muhammad Ali, who was Cassius Clay at the time, was a conscientious objector who actually went to prison, for his position regarding the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth. So I am particularly connected to this group of veterans. And I think that we have to look at four aspects of why our Vietnam veterans are so special. And then I'm going to bring it back together as far as why it's appropriate to discuss this on the CROC podcast, where it is for our cancer survivor thrivers. So number one, these young men and women got shipped off to the other side of the planet. So these are probably young people who have never even left the United States, probably have never left the county that they were born in. And they were sent to the other side of the planet to a third world country that had no resources. And it's been continually, and it was continually at war for decades. We were not the first, rodeo to come into Vietnam and try to, change things around a bit. I mean, the French had been trying to do that prior to us. And, and then there was the Chinese influence and the Russian influence and blah, 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 blah. And they had to endure unspeakable hardships. And I'm not even talking about war hardships. I'm just talking about disease and heat and illnesses and lack of comfort and those types of things. Number two, they had to fight an invisible enemy. So the Viet Cong were, and I say enemy actually with respect, and I think a Vietnam vet would agree with me, that these were just regular farming folk who were just sick and tired of having people come in and, basically mess up their country and just come in and do whatever they wanted. And you might have an interpreter during the day who was your friend. And then at night, they would go out into the rice paddies with, a knife or with a gun, and they would fight against you. So these were guerrilla tactics that we were not used to and not prepared for. And we didn't even know who our enemy was. In addition to that, the war that they came to fight, this was not World War II, where the entire world was in danger from an absolutely insane, Hitler, where who knows what the world would be like if actually Germany won that war. And everyone was in agreement that that could not happen. So anybody who went overseas to fight in World War II came home a hero. And it was not just, I wouldn't say the war was popular, because that's a terrible way of describing a war, but it certainly was unbelievable, coming home a hero, and no matter in what aspect you served in World War II. And the war in Vietnam was, at the very least, unpopular, and that's a very tepid word for how absolutely visceral, the Vietnam opposition was, the opposition to the Vietnam War. And it was downright unnecessary. We really shouldn't have been there. Number three, it was not a winnable war because we did not put the resources in to win the war. And it was unsupported, by our own countrymen. So these young men and women got sent halfway across the world to this shit show. And number three, they had come home after all the horror that they had to endure, not to parades, but to protests. And instead of shouts of thanks, there were shouts of hatred. And instead of those kisses, that famous picture of the guy, after the war ended, taking that woman and grabbing her and giving her a big kiss. And there was the life photograph of that. They didn't get kissed by anybody. They got actually spit on. So these poor guys coming home, these poor guys are absolutely getting all the wrath of the Americans. And then they were shown no appreciation. They were just shown ingratitude. So, they had, post-traumatic stress. They were, they came home, they were maladjusted. They didn't know what to do. They didn't fit into society. And last but not least, they became a ticking cancer time bomb because of their exposure to a pesticide that we call Agent Orange. And this is a pesticide that the government that sent these poor bastards over to fight this terrible war, and all the hardships they had to endure and all of the hostility that they had to deal with, they ended up coming home and getting sick and getting cancer. And the government for decades was absolutely, saying, you did not get this from your exposure. You did not get this from your exposure. We are not going to reimburse you. We are not going to cover you for the illnesses you got from serving in this unjust war, and for us poisoning you with this terrible, they call it, we're not going to use the actual chemical name on the podcast because it's even hard enough for, I can't even say it, but we're just going to call it dioxin. But by all accounts, probably the most toxic substance that has ever been produced by mankind. And wait till you hear the horror stories that I'm going to tell you about this terrible pesticide and the exposure of these poor, unfortunate, unassuming people that I get to see every day. I see a vet every day who has a cancer that was from Agent Orange. So I'm going to talk about one particular soldier and three others, and then we're going to get into the meat of it. So this is Dimitri's story. So today's podcast is dedicated to my friend Dimitri, who was one of those baby boomers whose father was a World War II vet, and he was born to serve, like in Tom Cruise's movie Born on the 4th of July. And, he served his country proudly. He volunteered. He went into the Marines. He was sent to Vietnam. He was involved in the Tet Offensive in 1967, 1968. He had shrapnel in his chest, and they took care of him, in Vietnam. And they said, "You're good. You're good to go." He gets discharged finally, after serving in Vietnam, and he comes home and he starts spitting up blood. And what happened was that shrapnel that went into his lung, they never took it out. It got infected, and the guy lost his lung. And this is a heroic guy. And then later in his life, he develops metastatic prostate cancer, which he's probably going to die from. And I'm looking at the correspondence. I have all his correspondence. And I remember my first letter that I sent to the VA, and that was to fight for them to, recognize that he was exposed to Agent Orange and should be, considered service related for his health care. Then I had to repeat, I had to keep repeating, sending letters every year just so they would continue to cover him. And I thought, wow, what is wrong with this story? Here's a heroic Marine, served at the worst time you could ever serve in Vietnam, got his butt handed to him, and came home, lost a lung because of the war, got prostate cancer because of the war, got metastatic prostate because of the war, and is probably going to die from his prostate cancer because of his exposure, and his government didn't support him. Second story is a gentleman by the name of Robert. This was a badass dude as well. Special Forces, Vietnam, 1967, 1968. He was also where he wasn't supposed to be, in Laos and Cambodia, where, basically these guys were swimming in dioxin. And basically he got a cancer of the GE junction, and the VA wouldn't recognize him until we had to send all these papers and all of these scientific, papers corresponding Agent Orange to this type of cancer. And he finally got covered, but not without a fight. There was a young man who was a sailor. Now, they call Vietnam vets who actually fought in Vietnam or served in Vietnam, they call them boots on the ground soldiers. But then they're the sailors who were on the aircraft carriers and the other ships that carried cans and cans and cans. And I'm not talking about like a can of beans or a can of tomato soup. I'm talking about industrial sized cans of dioxin on their ships. And the ship surfaces were bleeding orange, from all the chemicals that were leaching out, into the water systems. And this guy had to fight because the VA was like, well, you're not a soldier. You weren't in Vietnam. You never even stepped foot in Vietnam. And it was like, well, that might be true, but my ship carried an entire cargo bin full of dioxin which leaked into the water system or leaked into the areas, and we were all exposed. Lastly, my friend Peter, a little bit of a different exposure. He was a radio operator for the Air Force, but he had so much exposure to radio frequency radiation, he ended up with a brain tumor, and that took about 6 or 7 letters to get him to be recognized for his service. So I just wanted to tell you that some of these people have had 9-year battles with the VA only to be granted 20% disability and things like this. And it's a deny first attitude. It's just horrible. Number one, there was the denial that they even hurt anybody. And the whole Vietnam thing. It took us decades to finally recognize that we actually, for the government to admit that we actually lost the war and it was an unjust war and we shouldn't have been there in the first place. So imagine all the people who died unnecessarily. And then there's these guys and women that were exposed to Agent Orange who then got just left out, what's the expression, thrown under the bus, just left hanging in the wind with no coverage, after what the government did. So this podcast is a celebration of living and being a citizen of the greatest country that ever was, but also with the recognition that this is a dedication podcast to the people who served, all people who served, whether they were foreign vets or not, but specifically to our Vietnam veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. So, Angel, your thoughts so far before I actually get into the article?
I'm gonna save my thoughts for the end because I know that I have a special tribute, but I will say this. It's amazing how many, I am sure that there are a plethora of other stories, but the fact that you were able to give us 3 amazing hero stories is just the tip of what we haven't even touched the main source yet.
Awesome. So, I did, as I always do, my due diligence and prepare for each of these podcasts. And I found a beautiful little article from Roswell Park, which is a great cancer center in Buffalo, and basically talking a little bit about what exactly is Agent Orange, because nobody really knows exactly what it is. So the article starts with a very bold statement, and finally, after all these years, so it's 2024, and this happened started in 1962. So you can imagine, any veteran who served anywhere in Vietnam during the war is presumed to have been exposed to Agent Orange. So finally making some headway. So that's fantastic. So the article goes on to say, during the Vietnam War, the U.S. military sprayed the countryside in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos with more than 19 million gallons of herbicides, including 11 million gallons of Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a chemical blend named for the orange band that was on its storage barrel. The mission was codenamed Operation Ranch Hand, and it aimed to kill vegetation where the enemy, the Viet Cong, could hide, also destroy any crops they might use for food, and clear areas around military bases to prevent sneak attacks. From 1962 to 1971, Agent Orange rained down from helicopters and C-123 aircrafts onto farms, rice paddies, rivers, people, and animals. It was sprayed across the landscape by riverboats, trucks, and even soldiers who would wear the pesticide on their backpacks and then spray, kind of like the way we would spray weeds, when we're doing our own home landscaping. When the barrels were empty, the troops used to, and even the Vietnamese villagers would use them as barbecue grills or makeshift showers. Imagine that. Addressing safety concerns in 1966, a U.S. State Department official assured the public that the herbicides were non-toxic and not dangerous to man or animal life. Doubts began to creep in when service members who had been exposed to Agent Orange later developed type 2 diabetes and some types of cancer and other health issues at higher than normal rates. The children that these poor soldiers conceived after coming home also had higher than normal rates of birth defects, again, secondary to their exposure to Agent Orange. The main ingredient of Agent Orange is dioxin. The shortened abbreviated, I guess, nomenclature is TCDD. It's a highly toxic compound that causes cancer, disrupts hormones, and leads to other serious medical and reproductive problems. When people are exposed to dioxin, it builds up in the fatty tissues and is stored in the body for years. Dioxin remains in the environment for decades, perhaps even centuries, impacting the food chain and continuing to pose a health hazard to people and animals. Angel, it's estimated that between 2.6 and 3.8 million U.S. service members were exposed to Agent Orange. Exposure was not limited to military personnel who served overseas. Contaminated aircrafts that had Agent Orange and sprayed Agent Orange in Vietnam were still used in the Air Force, continuing to expose servicemen and women, including the reserve units, as late as 1981, 10 years after the spraying had ended. The Red Cross of Vietnam estimates that 3 million Vietnamese were also exposed, with 1 million of those developing health problems. The number included 150,000 children who were born with serious birth defects. And then the research, basically after the war, the veterans and their advocates finally pressed the federal government to recognize the link between Agent Orange and certain medical conditions. Can you imagine, Angel? The denial, the denial, the
Wow.
denial. And finally, thanks to a group of people, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of advocates of these poor veterans, finally got the righteous, answers and exposure that needed to be, that needed to come out. The Agent Orange Act of 1991 directed the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to review scientific evidence concerning those possible links and to issue reports every 2 years. It also called for the creation of a biobank of blood and tissue samples supplied by volunteers to continue their research. Today, the U.S. Veterans Administration recognizes that exposure to Agent Orange or other herbicides during military service is the probable cause of these cancers, and they include leukemias, lymphomas, both Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's, multiple myeloma, prostate cancer, lung, larynx, trachea, bronchial cancer, sarcomas, and finally now bladder cancer. And what I want to end this podcast with is not just what this information, but also what some of our veterans who may not have even known that they have access and have rights to certain special treatments if they've been exposed to Agent Orange and certain services. So what to know. If you served in Vietnam, specific locations in Thailand, the Korean demilitarized zone, or specific other areas during the Vietnam era, or held specific jobs in the military at that time, the VA presumes that you've been exposed to Agent Orange. Number one, you should share this information with your healthcare providers so they can determine whether you need additional cancer screening. Number two, let your doctor know right away if you develop symptoms of any of the cancers or other diseases on the VA list of diseases associated with Agent Orange. Be aware that new diseases are added to the list as ongoing research provides additional information. So check back from time to time for updates. And also, you have advocates at the VA. Some of them are good, some of them are not worth anything. But my friend Dimitri did have a very good guy who really went to bat for him. So try to find an advocate for you through the VA system. If you have an illness on that list, you may be eligible for medical benefits and disability compensation. You may be eligible for a free Agent Orange registry health exam, even if you are not ill, and even if you are not enrolled in the VA healthcare system. If any of your children were born with birth defects, they may also be eligible for benefits. And as of January 1st, 2020, if you served aboard a Blue Water Navy vessel offshore or on a Navy or Coast Guard ship in the coastal waterways of Vietnam between January 9th, 1962 and May 7th, 1975, you are also presumed to have been exposed to Agent Orange. You and your qualified dependents may also be eligible for benefits. Angel Santana, your thoughts on today's podcast?
Well, we've touched on a lot of things. And I can't help but think that, we're talking about all members of the military. all branches. And I think of the word veteran, I think of the word hero. I think of the fact that veterans are accepted in the responsibility to defend America and uphold our values when the duty was called into action. The only way that I could possibly somewhat relate to what we just discussed is to remind every single person that maybe haven't really understood what these brave men and women have done. Is only fitting that you hear the oath that they took. And that is, I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear truth, faith, and allegiance to the same, and that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States, the orders of the officers appointed over me, according to regulations and the Uniform Code of the Military Justice. So help me God. I am honored that we did this for you. I am honored that you have done this for us. And I hope that somewhere down the line, more efforts will be taken, better efforts will be taken to take care of those that have taken care of us.
Angel Santana, there are no words that I can to add to that. I will just say, since I have to close the podcast, to all of our veterans, whether you served overseas, whether you served in wartime, whether you were deployed or whether you were not, we absolutely appreciate you. To our Vietnam vets, especially those exposed to Agent Orange who are cancer survivor thrivers as a result to these exposures. We adore you. We embrace you. We absolutely uplift you. We sustain you, and we are grateful and appreciate your sacrifice you made for us, for our freedom. It doesn't matter what the politics are, because even as we're entering, an election year, and again, the CROC podcast is not political, but it is, very disconcerting to see what's going on in this country. And it is not your fault that you were sent to a godforsaken place to fight an unpopular, unnecessary war. It was not your fault. You should have come home to parades, not protests. You should have been kissed instead of spit on. You should have been appreciated, and you weren't. I am happy to say that Vietnam vets nowadays wear their hats proudly, and well, you should. Anytime I see one of you guys or one of you gals in those hats, you get a handshake from me with much gratitude and much appreciation. Today's podcast is devoted not just to those 4 men that I mentioned, but to every single survivor thriver who has served. And we will end today's podcast as we end every podcast, wishing every survivor thriver a long, healthy, happy, and cancer-free life. God bless you. God be with you. Peace.